The morning sun had barely broken through the folds of mist that hung over Lost Creek Valley, casting the land in pale gold when Caleb Rawlins rode out from his ranch. The rhythmic clop of his horse's hooves was the only sound across the silent prairie. For most men, this hour meant rest, but for Caleb, it was the only time he could think clearly, before the weight of loneliness and memory settled on him again. The death of his wife 3 winters past had carved a hollowness in him that the wide plains couldn't fill. His cattle had been straying near the northern lake, close to the disputed border where Apache hunting grounds met settler land. It was a risky area, but Caleb trusted the old trails. As he guided his horse down toward the glimmering water, a cry pierced the stillness. A woman's voice, sharp and desperate. He froze in the saddle, scanning the reeds and willows that ringed the lake. The cry came again, trembling. "They stole my clothes, rancher! Please help me!" Caleb's hand went to his revolver by instinct. The tension between Apaches and settlers had been on the rise. Raids, thefts, even killings. Every settler in the territory had heard stories of traps, of decoys sent to lure men into ambushes. But something in the voice struck him differently. It wasn't the voice of a trickster or a threat. It was frightened, human, vulnerable. He dismounted slowly, moving closer to the edge of the water. Through the reeds, he caught sight of her. A young Apache woman, half submerged in the shallows, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her long, wet hair clung to her shoulders. The lake's surface rippled around her as she shivered, looking toward him with wide, pleading eyes that carried both fear and dignity. She wasn't armed, and she wasn't pretending. She was truly in distress. Caleb turned his back at once, lowering his hat to give her modesty. "Ma'am," he said evenly, "I don't mean you harm. You say someone took your clothes?" "Yes," her voice quivered. "3 white men and from the mining camp." They laughed. They said they wanted to see what an Apache woman was worth. Her words trembled with humiliation. Caleb's jaw tightened. He'd seen men like that before, drifters, opportunists, men who used whiskey and cruelty to feed their pride. "Stay there," he said, shrugging off his long duster coat. Without turning, he tossed it over his shoulder into the reeds. "It's not much, but it'll cover you till we find what's yours." He heard the faint splash as she caught it and murmured something soft in Apache. Perhaps a thank you. When she stepped out of the lake a few minutes later, draped in his coat, he turned to face her. Beneath the mud and the fear, she was striking. Proud cheekbones, sun-browned skin, and eyes that burned with both fury and gratitude. "I'm Nayeli," she said quietly, clutching the coat around her. "My people camp 2 valleys north. I came to wash. They followed me." Caleb nodded. "You're safe for now. I'll see you back to your camp." Her chin lifted defiantly. "No, I want my things. My knife, my clothes. I'll not go home dishonored." He respected that resolve, though it meant trouble. He knew if he was seen escorting an Apache woman through settler land, tongues would wag, or worse, guns would rise. But as he looked at her, shivering beside the water, something deeper stirred in him. A memory of compassion, of the man he used to be before grief hardened him. He sighed, checking his rifle. "All right then, Miss Nayeli," he said. "Let's get your clothes back." And as they mounted his horse together, the first rays of sunlight burned away the mist. 2 strangers from opposite, worlds riding into a storm neither yet understood. Bond that would change both their fates began with that simple act of mercy by the silent lake. The morning air was still sharp, with chill as Caleb Rawlins led his horse along the narrow trail that skirted the lake's edge. Beside him rode Nayeli, her hair still damp, wrapped in his long coat like a makeshift blanket. The coat's heavy fabric dwarfed her frame, yet she carried herself with unmistakable poise, the quiet dignity of someone who refused to be a victim. No matter her circumstances, Caleb tried not to look at her too closely. The memory of her standing half-hidden in the water lingered uncomfortably in his mind. He was not a man easily unsettled, but there was something about her, her eyes, fierce and wounded, that had caught him off guard. She was no helpless girl. There was fire behind her sorrow. As they rode, Nayeli explained what had happened in short, clipped phrases. She had gone down to the water before dawn to bathe, something she did in secret, away from the men of her tribe. 3 white drifters, likely from the Silver Creek mining camp, had followed her. They taunted her, calling her savage, and when she ran into the lake for safety, they snatched up her clothes and belongings. One of them had taken her knife, a ceremonial blade that had belonged to her late brother. When she shouted for help, they laughed and rode off, leaving her stranded. Caleb's hands tightened on the reins. "I know the type," he muttered. "Men who think cruelty makes them strong." Naomi's eyes narrowed. "You are white, too. Are you not one of them?" The question struck like a whip. Caleb didn't answer right away. "No," he said finally. "I try not to be." He thought of his late wife, a kind woman who'd taught him that mercy wasn't weakness. Since her death, he'd built walls around himself. But something about this encounter chipped at them. They rode in silence for a while, following the faint tracks the drifters had left in the soft soil, 3 sets of hoof prints leading north toward the foothills. Every now and then, Caleb dismounted to study the ground, while Naomi scanned the horizon with sharp, watchful eyes. She moved like someone used to the wilderness, aware of every rustle and shadow. "You track well," Caleb said. "My father taught me before the soldiers came," she replied softly. "Before they burned our camp," Caleb said nothing. The mention of soldiers, of fire, was enough to remind him how much blood soaked this land. Blood that couldn't be washed away by good intentions alone. By midday, the tracks led to an old game trail marked with broken branches and the faint scent of smoke. The drifters had made camp somewhere ahead. Naomi's posture stiffened. "We are close," she said. Caleb looked at her, really looked. Beneath the mud and exhaustion, she was trembling. But it wasn't fear. It was fury. He admired her strength even as he feared it. "When we find them," he said, "let me handle the talking." "I want my knife," she replied firmly. "And I want them to know what they did." Caleb didn't argue. There was no changing her mind. She was proud, and that pride had been humiliated. He knew how deep that kind of wound went. They stopped briefly by a stream to rest. Caleb offered her a piece of jerky and a canteen. She accepted but didn't eat much. Her gaze remained distant, fixed on the horizon. "You didn't have to help me," she said suddenly. "Why did you?" He hesitated. "Because no one else would have." Naomi gave a faint, bitter smile. "You'll regret it when your people find out you helped an Apache." "Maybe," Caleb said, cinching his saddle strap. "But I've regretted worse." When they set off again, the trail grew narrower, twisting into a ravine lined with cottonwoods. Faint laughter echoed ahead, men's voices carried on the wind. Caleb raised his hand to stop her. Their quarry was near. As Naomi's hand brushed the hilt of Caleb's spare knife, their eyes met. 2 strangers bound by circumstance, mistrust, and something deeper neither dared name. Whatever happened next, the quiet mercy that began at the lake was about to be tested by blood and fire. Part 3. Signs of Violence. 600 words explanation. By the time Caleb Rawlins and Naomi reached the foothills, the sun had climbed high, beating down with the dry heat of mid-morning. Dust clung to their boots, and the silence between them grew heavier with every mile. The faint trail of hoof prints they'd been following was becoming harder to read, fading into the rocky terrain. But Naomi's sharp eyes never faltered. She moved like someone who had spent her life listening to the language of the earth. The broken branch, the disturbed stone, the faint scent of ash. Suddenly she stopped. "Here," she said, crouching near a patch of trampled grass. Caleb dismounted, leading his horse closer. Before them lay the remains of a small camp, a ring of smoldering ashes, scattered bottles, and a torn scrap of cloth tangled in the brush. Caleb knelt, lifting the fabric carefully. It was part of a woman's tunic, the embroidery unmistakably Apache. Naomi recognized it immediately. Her breath hitched. "That's mine," she whispered. "They were here." Caleb scanned the ground. And they didn't leave clean. Blood speckled the dirt. Not much, but enough to tell a story. A struggle had taken place. One man, maybe two, had been hurt. The tracks suggested they'd left in a hurry, one rider slumped or being supported by the others. Caleb's instincts told him this wasn't just a case of petty theft anymore. The drifters were on the run, desperate and dangerous. Nayeli stood beside him, trembling with a mix of fury and guilt. "I should have gone after them sooner," she muttered. Caleb shook his head. "You'd have gotten yourself killed." He examined the fire pit more closely. Among the ashes, something glinted. He reached in and pulled out a piece of metal, the charred remains of a U.S. cavalry button. His expression darkened. "These men aren't just miners," he said grimly. "They've seen war." That explained their confidence and their cruelty. Ex-soldiers turned drifters often roamed the borderlands, men with no allegiance left but to their own greed. They knew how to kill, and they didn't fear the consequences. Nayeli watched him, her eyes hard. Then they will know what it means to be hunted. Caleb didn't like the fire in her tone. "Revenge won't bring back your dignity," he said quietly. She turned on him, anger flashing. "You speak as if you understand, but you don't. They didn't just take my clothes, rancher. They took my honor, my brother's knife, the last piece of my family. To let them go is to say what they did means nothing." Caleb looked away, jaw tight. Her words struck deep, awakening old wounds of his own. The helplessness he'd felt when his wife was taken by fever and there was nothing he could do. He knew that kind of pain, the kind that demanded justice because forgiveness felt impossible. "All right," he said finally, standing. "Then we'll find them together." They followed the trail north, the landscape turning wilder and rockier. The tracks led toward Silver Creek, a rough mining town with no law but the gun. The place was notorious. Gamblers, bounty hunters, and outlaws all passed through its saloons and shanties. Caleb had sworn never to return after a near-fatal gunfight there years ago, but now he had no choice. As they rode, the first dark clouds gathered in the distance, hinting at an afternoon storm. Caleb kept his rifle across his saddle, senses sharp. Every rustle in the brush made him glance sideways. He could tell Nayeli was alert too, scanning the horizon for movement. When they stopped to rest at a small ridge overlooking the valley, Caleb pointed toward the distant smoke rising from Silver Creek. "That's where they're headed," he said. Nayeli's fingers brushed the knife at her waist, Caleb's spare, which he'd lent her earlier. "Then that's where I'll get back what's mine." He studied her, the determination in her posture, the quiet fire in her gaze, and knew she wouldn't stop until justice was done. But in his gut, he also knew that Silver Creek didn't forgive intruders, and bringing an Apache woman into its streets was like walking into a hornet's nest with no protection. Still, he nodded. "Then we ride at dawn." As thunder rumbled, far off across the plains, two riders sat in the gathering storm, a rancher haunted by guilt and a proud woman burning for retribution, both unaware that the path ahead would bind their fates forever in blood and trust. Part 4. Silver Creek's Shadows. 600 words explanation. By the next morning, the sun was already a molten coin above the horizon when Caleb Rawlins and Nayeli reached Silver Creek. The town sat wedged between red cliffs and dry scrubland, its crooked streets shimmering with heat and dust. Wooden signs creaked in the wind, and the air smelled of sweat, whiskey, and gun oil. Silver Creek wasn't a town for decent folk. It was a place where miners, gamblers, and drifters came to vanish. Caleb had hoped never to see it again. Years ago, he'd ridden through as a younger man, reckless and raw, and left with a bullet in his shoulder and a vow never to return. But now he had little choice. Nayeli's attackers were here. He could feel it in his bones. "Stay close," he said, pulling his hat low as they rode down the main street. "And don't meet anyone's eye unless you have to." Niley nodded, wrapped in his old coat to conceal her identity. Even so, her dark braids and proud bearing drew stares from the loafers outside the saloon. One of them spat into the dirt. "Rancher bringing his squaw into town now?" he muttered loudly. Caleb ignored it, jaw tight. If he reacted, they'd never make it out alive. They dismounted near the Rusty Spur, a rickety saloon that served as the unofficial headquarters for every kind of outlaw business. Caleb tied the horses and stepped inside, motioning for Nayeli to stay near the door. The air was thick with cigar smoke and the sour tang of whiskey. A piano played off-key in the corner, while men in dust-caked coats played cards and glared at newcomers. Caleb moved to the bar. "Looking for 3 men," he said to the barkeep, sliding a silver coin across the counter. "Rough lot, one with a scar across his cheek." The bartender eyed him, then the woman by the door. "Can't say I seen 'em," he drawled, pocketing the coin anyway. "But if you're smart, you'll ride on. This town don't take kindly to outsiders." Caleb's hand hovered near his gun belt. "Neither do I." Before the exchange could sour, a sharp, ugly laugh rose from the back of the saloon. Caleb turned, and there they were. 3 men, exactly as Nayeli had described, rough-bearded, dusty, and mean-eyed. The one with the scar grinned, recognizing the Apache woman by the door. "Well, look who came to town," he sneered. "Didn't think you'd have the guts to show your pretty face again." Nayeli's body stiffened. Caleb saw her hand twitch toward his spare knife, and he stepped forward quickly, murmuring, "Not here. Not yet." But it was too late. The scarred man's eyes shifted from her to Caleb, narrowing with sudden recognition. "I know you," he said darkly. "Rawlins, the rancher who got my brother hanged down in Abilene." Caleb's stomach dropped. He remembered the name now, Eli Murdoch, part of a rustler gang he'd testified against years ago. He hadn't realized one of them survived. Murdoch's hand went for his revolver. Caleb drew first. The shot cracked like lightning, shattering bottles behind the bar. Panic erupted. Chairs overturned, men dove for cover. Nayeli ducked low as gunfire ripped through the saloon. Caleb hit one of the drifters in the shoulder before they fled through the back door, leaving a trail of chaos in their wake. When the smoke cleared, Caleb staggered, clutching his side, grazed but not badly. Nayeli was already beside him, pressing a cloth to the wound. Her eyes were fierce, not afraid. "You saved me again," she whispered. Caleb winced. "You might have to return the favor before this is done." Outside, voices shouted. Bounty hunters and lawmen drawn by the gunfire. Caleb knew they had minutes, maybe less, before trouble closed in. He pulled Nayeli toward the back alley, slipping into the maze of narrow lanes behind the saloon. As they ran, thunder rolled in the distance, echoing off the canyon walls. The sky was darkening, the wind rising. Silver Creek's storm was coming, not just from the clouds, but from every man with a badge or grudge. By the time they reached the outskirts of town, Caleb's vision was blurring. Nayeli supported him as they found shelter in an abandoned line shack. He collapsed inside, breathing hard. Nayeli tore a strip from her coat to bind his wound, her hands steady and sure. "Why help me?" he asked weakly. "Your people owe mine nothing." She looked at him, eyes deep and unreadable. "Because you didn't turn away when I was alone in the water." Outside, lightning flashed, painting the sky in fire. Inside that shack, as the storm broke over the plains, the bond between rancher and Apache woman began to deepen. Tempered by danger, tested by blood, and shadowed by the promise of what was still to come. Part 5. Hiding in the Canyon. 600 words explanation. The storm swept over the plains like a living thing, tearing through Silver Creek and the canyons beyond. Rain poured in relentless sheets, turning the dust into rivers of mud and washing away the tracks of men. Caleb Rawlins and Naeli rode hard through the downpour, lightning flashing across the sky, their horses fighting for footing on the slippery ground. By nightfall, they reached an abandoned line shack nestled deep within a canyon, its roof half collapsed and walls sagging from years of neglect. Caleb could barely stay upright. The wound from the gunfight at the saloon had reopened, blood seeping through his shirt. When Naeli helped him down from his horse, he nearly fell. "Easy," she murmured, slipping an arm around him. "Sit. I'll take care of it." Inside the shack, she built a small fire using scraps of dry wood. The dim glow flickered against the rough-hewn walls, throwing shadows across Caleb's pale face. He tried to wave her off, insisting he'd be fine, but Naeli ignored him. She had seen enough wounded men in her life to know when one was lying. She tore what was left of her old tunic into strips, cleaned the wound with water from her canteen, and pressed the cloth firmly against his side. Caleb gritted his teeth but didn't pull away. Her hands were surprisingly gentle. "You've done this before," he managed to say through clenched teeth. Her expression softened. "My mother was the healer of our band. I learned from her before." Her voice trailed off, the memory too painful to finish. "Before the soldiers came," he guessed quietly. She nodded, eyes shadowed. "They came for our horses. Said we were stealing from settlers. My brother fought them, and they shot him. My mother tried to save him, but they burned our camp. I buried them myself." Caleb looked into the flames, jaw tight. "I'm sorry." "You didn't do it," she replied, though her tone was weary rather than forgiving. "But your people did." Silence filled the shack, broken only by the wind and rain outside. Caleb wanted to say something more, something that could bridge the wide gulf between them, but words felt useless. He'd spent his life believing the world could be divided neatly between good men and bad, but sitting beside Naeli now, this woman the world called his enemy, that certainty was gone. After tending to his wound, Naeli sat across from him, wrapping herself in his coat for warmth. The firelight caught the gold flecks in her eyes. "You could leave me," she said suddenly. "Take your horse and ride home. You owe me nothing." Caleb shook his head slowly. "I told you before, I don't turn my back on someone who needs help. Besides," he gave a faint, wry smile, "you'd never make it out of here without that knife you borrowed." A small smile touched her lips, despite herself. "Then I'll return it when this is done." They shared a quiet moment, two wounded souls drawn together by circumstance and a sense of unspoken respect. Outside, the storm raged, but inside, the air felt strangely calm. When Caleb's strength faded, Naeli pulled a blanket over him and watched as his breathing steadied. In the firelight, he looked different, not like a hardened rancher, but like a man who carried too much sorrow. She reached out as if to brush a strand of hair from his forehead, then stopped herself. Attachment was dangerous. For her, trust had always come at a price. As the night deepened, she sat by the door, listening to the rain. Her mind drifted to her brother, to his laughter, his courage, and his death. The same men who had stolen her clothes had stolen him too, in a way, men of the same cruelty, wearing different faces. But now she had a purpose, and with Caleb's help, she would make them answer for every humiliation. Before dawn, she dozed lightly, knife in hand, while Caleb slept fitfully behind her. When the rain stopped, the canyon was filled with mist, and the first light of day filtered through the cracks in the roof. The storm had washed away their tracks, but also any chance of going back. Naeli rose, her eyes on the pale morning sky. "They'll be hunting us," she whispered. Caleb stirred, opening one eye. "Then we'd best stay one step ahead." And as they saddled up to ride once more, both knew that the fragile trust they had built in that storm-racked canyon was only the beginning of something neither of them could yet name. A bond forged by danger, tested by fire, and destined to defy every law of their divided world. Part 6. The Searchers. 600 words explanation. By the time the rain cleared and the plains began to dry, word had already spread across the frontier. Rancher Caleb Rawlins had been seen riding with an Apache woman. The whispers grew like wildfire. Some said he'd been ambushed and taken hostage. Others claimed he'd turned traitor, running off with a savage woman after killing miners in Silver Creek. Whatever the version, one fact was certain. A posse was coming. Caleb and Nayeli rode east, keeping to the canyons and ravines where the shadows still lingered from the storm. The landscape smelled of wet sage and mud, the air heavy with silence. Caleb could feel eyes on them even when none were there. Every broken branch, every echoing hoofbeat sounded like pursuit. At midday, they stopped by a rocky ridge overlooking the valley below. Caleb scanned the horizon with his spyglass. In the far distance, a dust trail rose, too straight and too steady to be wild horses. "They've found us," he muttered. 5, maybe 6 riders. Nayeli stiffened. "White men?" "Settlers," he confirmed grimly. "Some from Silver Creek, some from the law, and the man leading them. I'd bet my last dollar it's Marshal Denton." Nayeli's expression hardened. She had heard the name before. Denton, a man with a reputation for cruelty disguised as justice. He'd been the one who'd ordered the burning of several Apache camps years ago. Caleb knew this too, though he had never agreed with Denton's ways. "You should leave me," Nayeli said suddenly, voice low but firm. "If they catch you with me, they'll hang you beside me." Caleb shook his head, tightening the cinch on his saddle. "Not happening." "This isn't your fight." He looked at her, his blue eyes steady beneath the brim of his hat. "It became my fight the moment I gave you that coat by the lake. You think I'd turn my back now?" Her lips parted as if to argue, but no words came. For the first time, her defiance faltered, replaced by something softer, confusion, maybe even gratitude. She wasn't used to men standing beside her without expecting something in return. They set off again, heading deeper into Apache territory where Denton's men would hesitate to follow. The land changed as they rode. The soil reddened, the rocks rose higher, and ancient petroglyphs marked the canyon walls. Nayeli relaxed slightly as they entered the sacred lands of her people. Caleb, however, felt the weight of trespass with every step. "Your people won't take kindly to a white man in their valley," he said. "They will if I speak for you," Nayeli replied. "But you must show respect." Before Caleb could respond, the distant thunder of hooves echoed behind them. The posse had closed the gap faster than expected. Dust plumed over the ridge. "Go!" he shouted, spurring his horse forward. They galloped through the narrow canyon, the sound of gunfire cracking behind them. Bullets ricocheted off the rocks, showering them with stone fragments. Caleb turned in the saddle, firing 2 shots to slow the pursuit. Nayeli rode like the wind, guiding them through the maze of red cliffs with the confidence of someone who knew every turn. Finally, they burst into a hidden valley veiled by tall pines and mist. Nayeli dismounted, breathing hard. "We're close to my people," she said. "They will protect us, if they believe you mean no harm." Caleb nodded, though his mind raced. He knew what it meant for a white man to walk into an Apache camp. He could be killed before a word was spoken. But he had no choice. The posse would not stop until they'd hunted them both down. That night, they camped beneath an overhang. The firelight danced on their faces, 2 fugitives from opposite worlds, bound by circumstance and trust. "You could still ride south," she murmured, watching him through the flickering light. "Start over. Forget this." He met her gaze steadily. "I've been running from ghosts for years, Nayeli. I won't add yours to the list." Her eyes softened. For the first time since he met her, she smiled. Not a polite or guarded smile, but something genuine. "Then perhaps the spirits sent you for a reason." Above them, The stars stretched wide and endless over the desert sky. But in the distance, somewhere beyond the ridge, the faint echo of the posse's horses carried on the wind. Caleb knew the chase wasn't over, only paused. Tomorrow, he would follow Nayeli into the heart of her people's land, where the next test awaited him. Between the law of men and the law of the Apache, he would have to choose which side of the line his soul belonged to. Part 7. The Camp of Shadows. 600 words explanation. Dawn broke over the red cliffs, painting the canyon in hues of gold and blood. Caleb and Nayeli rode in silence, their horses weary but determined. The trail wound through towering rocks, carved by centuries of wind and rain, until, at last, the land opened to reveal a hidden valley, the heart of her people's world. Smoke curled lazily from distant fires, and figures moved among the pines, Apache warriors armed with bows, rifles, and suspicion. As the pair approached, several riders broke away from the tree line and galloped toward them. Caleb instinctively reached for his revolver, but Nayeli lifted a hand. "Do not draw," she said firmly. "They are my kin." The men surrounded them swiftly, their eyes sharp and unreadable. One of them, tall and scarred, barked something in Apache. Nayeli responded in her native tongue, her words quick, urgent, pleading. Caleb could tell she was defending him, but the warriors' faces remained hard. Finally, the leader, the scarred one, dismounted and stepped closer. He pointed at Caleb, then at the rifle slung over his saddle, and spoke a single word that needed no translation. "Why?" Nayeli answered quietly, her voice trembling with emotion. The warrior listened, then spat into the dust. Turning to Caleb, he said in rough English, "White man not welcome here. You bring death." Caleb dismounted slowly, holding his hands up to show he meant no harm. "I didn't come here to fight," he said calmly. "I came because your people's enemies are mine now." The man narrowed his eyes. "All white men lie." Caleb met his gaze steadily. "Then let my actions speak before my words." For a long moment, no one moved. Then, from deeper in the camp, an older woman's voice broke the tension. "Let them through," she said. The warriors parted to reveal a frail elder wrapped in a blanket of woven colors. Her eyes, though dim with age, carried the weight of wisdom. "Grandmother," Nayeli whispered, rushing to her side. "It is I, Nayeli." The old woman's hand trembled as she touched her granddaughter's face. "Child, we thought you were taken by the traders." "I escaped," Nayeli said softly. "But they would have found me again if not for him." She gestured to Caleb, who stood awkwardly, hat in hand, feeling every stare burn into him. The elder studied him. "A white man saving an Apache woman? Strange times we live in." Caleb inclined his head respectfully. "Ma'am, I only did what was right," the elder nodded slowly. "Perhaps, but right and wrong are not so easily told between our worlds." The camp remained tense as they entered. Some whispered curses. Others watched in silence. Nayeli led Caleb to a small shelter where they were given food and water. Though he was grateful, Caleb could feel the hostility around him like the heat from a forge. That night, Nayeli's grandmother called a council of elders. They sat around a fire, their faces lit by its orange glow. Caleb was brought before them to explain himself. Through Nayeli's translation, he told his story, how he found her, how the miners had planned to sell her, and how the law had twisted the truth against them both. When he finished, silence fell. Finally, one of the elders spoke. "If you stay, the soldiers will come. They will bring fire and iron." "I know," Caleb said quietly. "But if I leave, she dies. And I can't let that happen." The old woman leaned forward, her voice soft but firm. "You speak with courage, rancher, but courage alone may not save you here." Then she turned to Nayeli. "You have brought a stranger into our sacred valley. You must answer for what comes next." Nayeli bowed her head. "Then I will answer for him. If blood must be spilled, let it be mine." The fire crackled. No one spoke. Then, almost imperceptibly, the elder nodded. "So be it. He may stay, for now. But when the sun sets twice, we will decide his fate." That night, as the camp slept, Caleb sat awake outside the shelter. The moonlight bathed the valley in silver. He could hear distant drums, the rhythm of a people both mourning and preparing. He glanced toward Nayeli's sleeping form and whispered to the wind, "2 sunsets. That's all I've got to earn my place." Unbeknownst to them both, Marshal Denton's posse had already reached the edge of the canyons, and they had no intention of waiting for the sun to set even once. Part 8. The Blood Moon Oath. 600 words explanation. The next morning dawned crimson, the sky streaked with the fiery hue of dawn that mirrored the unease hanging over the Apache camp. The warriors moved with quiet purpose, sharpening knives, tending horses, scouting the ridges. They knew something was coming, and deep down, Caleb Rawlins knew it too. He awoke to the smell of smoke and the murmur of voices outside the shelter. Nayeli was already gone. Rising, he stepped outside into the cool air, his boots crunching the dry earth. All eyes turned toward him, the stranger, the white rancher among them. He could feel the distrust radiating from every face. An older warrior approached, the same scarred man who had first confronted him at the camp's edge. "You," he said in a thick accent, "come with me." Caleb followed without protest. They walked through the camp until they reached a stone circle where several elders, including Nayeli's grandmother, waited. Nayeli stood beside them, her face painted with white clay. She gave him a quick, reassuring glance before the elder woman spoke. "Rancher," said the grandmother, her voice solemn, "our scouts saw riders on the western ridge at dawn. 6, maybe 7. They are white men, armed. They will reach this valley by nightfall." Caleb's heart tightened. "Denton," he murmured. The grandmother nodded slowly. "The one you call Denton brings death with him. We have seen his kind before." Nayeli stepped forward. "Grandmother, he came for me. If I am gone, he may leave them in peace." But Caleb shook his head sharply. "No, you think he'll stop?" "He'll tell every settler there's a camp here. The army will come next and they'll wipe this valley clean. He's not after you anymore. He's after me," the warriors muttered among themselves. The scarred man crossed his arms. "Then you should leave before the sun reaches its peak." Caleb hesitated, then looked at Nayeli. "And what happens to her when I do?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Finally, Nayeli's grandmother raised her hand for quiet. "There is another way," she said, "but it is a dangerous one. For both of you." She gestured for Nayeli and Caleb to kneel before the fire. "In our law, when a person from outside the tribe saves one of our own, and that act is true and selfless, there can be a blood moon oath, an ancient bond. It makes them kin under the eyes of the spirits. The oath cannot be broken without angering the ancestors." Nayeli's eyes widened. "Grandmother, that oath is sacred. It was meant for warriors." The old woman nodded. "And what is he if not a warrior now?" The meaning of her words sank into Caleb like a stone in water. If he swore the oath, he would be bound to Nayeli and her people forever. He would no longer be a man of the frontier, but one of the tribe. The settlers would call him a traitor, and the law would mark him for death. But if he refused, he'd bring ruin to this valley. Slowly, Caleb removed his hat and said, "Tell me what I must do." A hush fell over the camp. The grandmother nodded approvingly. A small blade was brought forth, its edge glinting in the firelight. Nayeli's hand trembled slightly as she took it. "We both bleed," she said quietly. "And the fire takes what we give." She sliced a shallow cut across her palm. Then, without hesitation, Caleb did the same. They pressed their hands together over the flame, their mingled blood dripping into the fire. Smoke curled upward, twisting into strange shapes before vanishing into the morning sky. The grandmother spoke in Apache, her voice carrying through the valley. "Under the blood moon, 2 souls become one fate. What happens to one will follow the other." When it was done, the camp was silent. Some of the warriors bowed their heads. Others turned away, uncertain. Nayeli and Caleb rose, their hands bound by a strip of cloth. For a fleeting moment, their eyes met, and in that look, something wordless passed between them. Later that afternoon, Caleb prepared the camp's defenses. He helped the warriors dig shallow pits and move rocks to block the valley's entrance. Nayeli stayed close, guiding him, translating orders. Despite the fear that pressed on them, there was also unity now, a shared purpose. As the sun dipped low, the first echo of gunfire rolled across the canyon. Dust rose from the ridge where Marshal Denton and his posse appeared, their rifles glinting in the dying light. The Blood Moon oath had been sealed, and before night fell, it would be tested by fire, bullets, and betrayal. Part 9. The Siege of the Valley. 600 words explanation. The last light of day bled out over the red cliffs as the first shots cracked across the canyon. The echoes bounced like thunder between the stone walls. Marshal Denton and his men had arrived, their silhouettes ghostly in the distance. 7 riders, rifles raised, the law of the frontier twisted in their hands. Caleb crouched behind a boulder, rifle steady. Around him, Apache warriors moved like shadows, taking their positions on the ridges and among the pines. Smoke from small fires curled upward, a lure to confuse the attackers. The air smelled of dust, gunpowder, and tension thick enough to choke on. From the ridge, Denton's voice boomed, carried by the wind. "Caleb Rawlins, you've made a damn fool of yourself, boy. Hand over the squaw and ride out now, and I might just let you live." Caleb's jaw tightened. He recognized that tone, half mockery, half promise of violence. He shouted back, "You've got no right here, Denton. Leave now before you start something you can't finish." The marshal's laugh was harsh. "You're already finished, son. You just don't know it yet." Then came the volley, gunfire cracking through the valley. Bullets tore bark from trees and sent dust spraying into the air. Caleb fired back, his shot dropping one of Denton's men clean off his horse. The warriors around him answered with arrows and rifles of their own, their battle cries echoing through the canyon like the spirits of old. Nayeli fought beside him, her bow singing as she loosed arrow after arrow. Though her arms trembled, her aim was true. "They won't stop," she shouted over the noise. "They'll burn everything." "I know," Caleb gritted, reloading. "Then we make sure there's nothing left for them to burn." For hours, the battle raged in bursts, fierce clashes followed by eerie silence. The posse tried to advance, but the narrow paths and traps laid by the Apache warriors slowed them. 2 riders fell into a pit disguised with brush, their screams echoing up the cliffs. Others took cover behind rocks, firing blindly into the valley. As night fell, the fighting ebbed. The sound of crickets and the occasional distant gunshot replaced the chaos. Caleb used the quiet to tend to the wounded. He bound a warrior's shoulder, then turned to Nayeli, whose arm had been grazed by a bullet. She winced as he cleaned the wound. "You're a fool," she whispered, her tone a mix of pain and admiration. "Maybe," Caleb replied with a faint smile. "But it's your kind of foolishness that got me here." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and something unspoken passed between them, something that neither the bullets nor the canyon walls could destroy. But the calm didn't last. At midnight, a scream shattered the quiet. A scout came running into camp, his chest bleeding. "More riders," he gasped. "Soldiers! Maybe 20. The words hit like a hammer. Denton had gone further than anyone imagined. He'd called in the army. Panic rippled through the camp. Mothers gathered children, warriors grabbed what weapons they could. Nayeli's grandmother ordered the sacred artifacts buried. She knew what was coming. Caleb ran to the edge of the camp, looking out toward the ridges. He could see the glint of lanterns moving, a line of soldiers winding down the canyon path like a snake of fire. "We can't fight that many," Caleb said, breathless. Nayeli's grandmother stepped forward, her voice steady despite her frail frame. "Then we do not fight like men. We fight like the land itself, and vanish before they can claim it." Nayeli turned to Caleb, eyes fierce. "We must lead them away, you and I. If we ride to the far ridge, we can draw them off while the others escape through the river trail." Caleb hesitated. That's suicide. Maybe, she said softly, but it's the only way. He looked at her, at the woman who'd once stood trembling in a lake begging him for help, and saw now a warrior ready to die for her people. Something inside him shifted, deeper than duty, deeper than fear. He loaded his rifle and nodded. All right, Niley, we ride. As they mounted their horses, the moon rose red and full over the valley, the same blood moon under which they had sworn their oath. Its light glowed on their faces, painting them in shades of fire and fate. Behind them, the Apache camp began to fade into darkness, disappearing into the forest trails. Ahead of them, down in the canyon, the soldiers moved like an iron tide. Niley glanced at him once, her expression fierce yet calm. When dawn comes, one of us will still be standing. Caleb met her gaze, his voice low. Then let's make sure it's you. With that, they spurred their horses and rode toward the enemy. Two figures racing into the teeth of destiny, bound by blood, love, and a promise to protect the last piece of a dying world. Part 10. The Ride Through Fire. 600 words explanation. The night swallowed them as they galloped out of the Apache Valley, two silhouettes streaking through moonlight and dust. The air burned cold in their lungs, and the sound of hooves echoed like thunder rolling down the canyon walls. Behind them, the flicker of torches marked the advance of Marshal Denton's soldiers, their shouts bouncing against the stone cliffs. Caleb Rawlins rode ahead, his eyes scanning the dark ridge lines. Every shadow looked like danger. Every gust of wind whispered death. Beside him, Niley rode fearlessly, her long hair streaming behind her, her bow clutched tight. Together, they were little more than ghosts in the desert, fugitives running not for their lives, but for the lives of everyone still hiding in the valley. We need to reach the far ridge before dawn, Niley shouted over the wind. If they follow us that far, my people will be safe. Caleb nodded, though doubt gnawed at him. There were too many soldiers, too many rifles. They won't stop, he said grimly. Denton won't stop till he's buried us both. He will, she said, her tone iron. We'll make him. They crossed a shallow stream, hooves splashing through silver ripples, and climbed toward higher ground. The terrain grew jagged, the air thin. Far below, the glow of campfires spread like a sickness across the canyon floor. The army had made camp in the valley they'd just left, but the Apache had escaped through the eastern river trail, just as planned. As they rode, memories flickered. Through Caleb's mind, the first moment he saw Niley at the lake, the fear in her eyes, the defiance that followed, the oath beneath the blood moon. What began as an act of compassion had become a test of his soul. Somewhere along the line, she had stopped being a stranger to him. She was his compass now, his reason. Hours passed. The wind picked up, carrying sand and the faint sound of pursuit. The soldiers had found their trail. Gunshots cracked in the distance, the echoes splitting the night. Caleb looked over his shoulder. Dark shapes on horseback were closing in fast. "Keep riding!" he yelled, spurring his horse harder. They tore across the plateau, weaving between boulders and dry gullies. Bullets hissed past, striking sparks off the rocks. One whizzed so close that Caleb felt the heat graze his cheek. He turned and fired twice, dropping a soldier's horse. The man tumbled into the dust with a scream, but the rest kept coming. Niley led him toward a narrow ravine, a winding path between cliffs that could be their salvation or their tomb. "This way," she shouted. "They can't spread out. Here, only 2 riders can pass at once." They plunged into the ravine. The walls closed around them, the moonlight fading into a thin silver ribbon overhead. Gunfire echoed like thunderclaps, and shards of stone rained down. Niley drew an arrow and fired behind them, hitting one pursuer clean through the chest. When they finally burst out onto open ground again, they were both gasping, their horses trembling beneath them. They had reached the far ridge, a wind-swept rise overlooking miles of desert. From here they could see the entire valley burning faintly in the distance like a scar across the earth. Caleb dismounted, reloading his rifle. Nayeli joined him, scanning the horizon. "We can't run anymore," she said quietly. "We stand here." He looked at her, dirt-streaked, bloodied, fierce, and felt something swell in his chest, something like pride mixed with sorrow. "Then we make it count." They took positions among the rocks, side by side. Caleb laid out his last box of cartridges. Nayeli strung her final arrows. The wind howled through the canyon, carrying the distant clatter of hooves. The first soldiers appeared on the trail below, a line of shadows climbing steadily toward them. At their head rode Marshal Denton, his long coat whipping behind him like a banner of vengeance. Caleb raised his rifle and whispered, "You wanted me, Denton. Come and take me." The battle that followed was short, brutal, and blinding. Bullets tore the night apart. Nayeli's arrows found their marks, swift and deadly. Caleb fought like a man possessed, firing until his gun was too hot to hold. But there were too many. An explosion shattered the ridge. A stray bullet had ignited a crate of powder. The blast sent both of them tumbling into the dust. Caleb's ears rang, his vision blurred. Through the smoke, he saw Denton dismount, pistol in hand, walking toward them. Nayeli staggered to her feet, her bow gone, blood streaking her temple. She moved to stand between Caleb and Denton, her breath ragged but her gaze steady. "Move aside," Denton barked. "He's mine." Her answer was quiet, defiant. "You will have to kill me first." The marshal raised his gun, and under the red, flickering light of the burning ridge, the blood moon oath was about to claim its price. Part 11. The Price of the Oath. 600 words explanation. Smoke hung thick over the ridge, curling in ghostly ribbons through the moonlight. The air reeked of gunpowder and blood. The battle had ended in silence, except for the echo of horses retreating, the soldiers regrouping below. Only 3 figures remained atop the rocky rise. Marshal Denton, his revolver gleaming in the dim light. Nayeli standing between him and Caleb himself, half-conscious, one hand pressed against a bleeding wound in his side. "Step away, girl," Denton growled, his voice sharp as broken glass. "You don't understand what you're protecting." Nayeli stood tall despite her trembling. "I know exactly what I'm protecting," she said. Her tone was calm, but her eyes burned with fury. "A man who saved me when your kind would have sold me like cattle. A man who fights for honor, not hate," Denton sneered. "Honor, he's a fool who betrayed his own. The law doesn't forgive that. The law," she spat. "Your law burns villages and calls it justice. Your law kills children and buries them under the name of order." For a brief second, Denton hesitated. Her words hit him like stones against a fortress, small, but unrelenting. He raised his revolver again. "Last warning, move!" Behind her, Caleb stirred. "Nayeli," he coughed, his voice weak but urgent. "Don't, he'll shoot you." She didn't turn. "If he does, the spirits will remember." Caleb tried to push himself up, but his strength was failing. The world swam before his eyes. He saw Denton's finger tighten on the trigger, and instinct screamed at him to act. Somehow, through the pain, he managed to draw his own revolver. The shot rang out, one, then another. For a moment, everything froze. Then Denton staggered backward, a look of disbelief on his face. He'd fired too, and Nayeli fell to her knees, a dark stain spreading across her chest. Caleb crawled to her, dropping his weapon, pulling her into his arms. "Nayeli, no, stay with me," he gasped, pressing his hand against her wound. Her blood felt hot against his skin. Her eyes fluttered open. It doesn't hurt," she whispered. "The fire. It's gone." "Don't talk like that," he said, his voice breaking. "You're gonna make it. You have to." She smiled faintly, her lips trembling. "You made your choice, Caleb Rawlins, between the law of men and the law of the heart." He shook his head, tears cutting through the grime on his face. "I didn't choose anything. I just found something worth fighting for. Her breathing slowed. Then fight for it still. Live for it. And with that, her hand slipped from his, her eyes closing softly as her spirit drifted away beneath the blood-red moon. For a long while, Caleb just held her, numb to everything else. The wind, the stars, the world itself. The blood moon oath had demanded a price, and the spirits had taken it. When the numbness finally cracked, rage flooded in its place. He laid Nayeli gently on the ground and turned to Denton, who was still breathing, slumped against a rock, one hand pressed to the gunshot wound in his chest. Was it worth it? Caleb rasped, standing over him. All your talk of justice? This what it looks like to you? Denton coughed blood, sneering weakly. You think saving her made you a hero? You're nothing but a traitor to your own. Caleb knelt beside him, his voice low and cold. Maybe so, but at least I can die knowing I tried to be human. He picked up Denton's revolver, the same one that had killed Nayeli, and tossed it down the ravine. Then he turned back to her body, lifting her into his arms one last time. As dawn crept over the horizon, he carried her down from the ridge toward the valley. The sky was still tinged red from the fires, but the birds were beginning to sing again. The Apache had returned. Her people emerged from the forest shadows, silent and mourning. When they saw Caleb, their weapons lowered. He laid Nayeli before her grandmother, bowing his head. She kept her promise, he said softly. She saved them all! The old woman's eyes glistened, though her face remained strong. And now the oath passes to you, she said. Her spirit will watch what you do with the life she gave you. Caleb said nothing. He simply looked down at Nayeli, the morning light spilling over her face. Peaceful at last. For the first time since he'd met her, she looked free. And in that silence, Caleb Rawlins knew that freedom, real freedom, wasn't won with guns or laws. It was paid for in love, in sacrifice, and in blood beneath a red moon. Part 12. The Last Sunrise. 600 words explanation. The first rays of dawn broke over the high ridges, painting the desert gold and scarlet. The fires had burned out, leaving only trails of black smoke rising from the valley below. The battle was over. The soldiers were gone. But the cost was written everywhere, in the ashes, in the silence, and in the still form that lay wrapped in a woven blanket beneath the tallest pine. Nayeli's body rested in peace, her hands folded across her chest, her hair braided with desert flowers. Her grandmother knelt beside her, chanting softly in Apache, the words carrying the rhythm of wind and morning. Around them, the tribe gathered in solemn silence. And standing apart from them all, his hat in his hands and his heart hollow, was Caleb Rawlins. He hadn't slept. He hadn't spoken since the moment he brought Nayeli down from the ridge. His wound had been tended by the women, but the ache in his chest, that deep, unhealing pain, had no remedy. He stood like a man carved from stone, staring at the earth that would soon claim her. When the chants ended, the grandmother rose and turned to him. The spirits know her now, she said quietly. They will carry her to the stars. But her blood still lives in you, rancher. The oath bound your souls. You are part of our story now, and whether you wish it or not. Caleb's throat tightened. I wish I could have saved her, the old woman shook her head. You did. She saved us all through you. She gave her life so her people could live. That is what the spirits will remember. He looked down at the bundle of woven cloth, and his vision blurred. She shouldn't have had to die for that, he murmured. The grandmother laid a hand on his arm, a rare gesture of acceptance. The world of men and the world of spirits are not fair, Caleb Rawlins. They only are. By midday, the burial was complete. The tribe sang one final song, low and haunting, echoing through the valley. Then the people began to move on, scattering into the forest trails. They would not stay. The soldiers would return one day, and they would not find the Apache again. Like ghosts, the tribe melted into the wilderness, carrying only what they could. When the camp emptied, Caleb stayed behind. He sat beside the grave, the desert wind whispering through the grass. For hours he said nothing. He just listened, to the rustle of leaves, to the cry of a hawk circling above, to the faint rhythm of his own heartbeat reminding him he was still alive. Finally, as the sun began to sink, he spoke aloud, not to anyone but to the earth itself. "You once asked me to live for it," he said softly. "To fight for something worth saving. I think I understand now." He reached into his coat and pulled out the silver pendant Nayeli had worn, a small charm shaped like a crescent moon. He placed it on the grave. "You'll always ride with me, girl," he whispered. "No matter where the trail ends." Then he stood, slinging his rifle over his shoulder. His body ached, his side throbbed, but his eyes were clear. He turned toward the horizon, where the land stretched endless and wild. Somewhere out there were settlers who'd lost their way, miners still burning greed into the soil, soldiers chasing ghosts they didn't understand. Caleb didn't know what his next step would be, only that he couldn't go back to who he was. That man, the rancher who cared only for his land and his quiet life, had died on that ridge with Nayeli. As he mounted his horse, the wind carried a faint whisper through the canyon, a woman's voice, soft and steady, saying his name. He froze, eyes searching the cliffs, but there was no one there. Only the setting sun and the echo of a promise made beneath the blood moon. He smiled faintly. "I hear you, Nayeli," he murmured. "I'll keep riding." With a click of the reins, he turned his horse toward the open plains. The sky was painted in crimson and gold, the same colors that had marked their first meeting. He rode until the light swallowed him, a lone figure against the burning horizon, a man carrying both love and loss into the untamed heart of the frontier. Behind him, the wind stirred the earth one last time over her grave, scattering petals and sand until her resting place shimmered in the dying sun. And so ended the story of Caleb Rawlins and Nayeli, the rancher and the Apache woman, two souls bound by blood, by courage, and by a promise that outlived them both. In that lonely valley, beneath the last light of day, the land held their memory, and whenever the blood moon rose again, the spirits whispered their tale of a love born in fire and a freedom paid for with the truest kind of sacrifice.